Important to be clear there, Dumi, one of our headlines talking about SAA operating charter flights to repatriate foreign nationals back to their countries. Important to clarify that it's specific groups of foreign nationals whose embassies are liaising with SAA for those charter flights to take place. It's quite easy for people to misunderstand.
Absolutely.
And you completely have a different message altogether out there. But to this now, and videos have been doing the rounds on social media of soldiers and members of the SAPS and police in general humiliating citizens. Human rights organization, the Justice Desk, says the lockdown regulations should not be an excuse to slip up upholding human rights. Government has reiterated the importance of combating COVID-19, but the same message should be for law enforcement agents not to abuse their power. The Justice Desk Executive Director, Jessica Dewhurst, joins us now via Skype for a conversation. As you and I speak, Jessica, there have been a litany of complaints to the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, the IPID. We don't really know what the provision is for oversight on the activities of members of the SANDF when they are operating within the country. Does this picture of complaints about humiliation of citizens being made to do squats and people being told to roll on the ground until they get to their homes, of beatings and discharge of firearms, how concerned are you about it?
We're quite concerned about this. During times of pandemic, during any times like this, it's vitally important that we remember to uphold human rights. And I know during this time of COVID-19, we are voluntarily limiting some of our freedoms with the lockdown, but that doesn't mean that we're giving up all our fundamental human rights. And it means that now more than ever as a country, we need to be standing up to defend our human rights, to ensure that people still have access to things like food and medicine and water, which are also major rights which need to be protected during this time.
I want to know what you think the Ministry or the Department of Defense role in all of this, and how they should be ensuring that, members of the Army as well as members of the SANDF do not cross that human rights and humanities line, especially during this time. Could they play an more active role, you think?
Hugely so. I think that all our security forces and our police need to be properly trained in how to actually engage with citizens, especially on the streets in difficult situations. I think this is a very stressful and difficult time, especially in our township communities. We have families who are having to make the choice between starvation and COVID-19. And at the end of the day, when you have your families who are starving, especially children, parents will make a decision to go outside to make sure that they can care for their families. So I think what we need to try and do is help our law enforcement to understand the bigger picture here, which is that, yes, lockdown is vitally important, but they need to understand the context that our South African people are currently living in, which is that COVID is a major effect on their lives, but it's not the only effect that's happening right now. There are major systemic injustice issues which they are also dealing with on top of COVID. So I believe a lot of training still needs to go into assisting our police in how to deal in high stress situations, how to deal in situations of conflict. Because a lot of South Africans will step forward and say, well, why do I have to go home? I have to feed my family. I have questions. But instead of turning to violence, we should be turning to education and training and helping South Africans to come on board with understanding why a lockdown is so important. But we can't do this if our response is immediately violence and humiliation and violating human rights, because our people will then not respect anything that our law enforcement says. They're supposed to be defending human rights. They're not supposed to be violating them.
Yeah. So put a demographic and perhaps class hue to it and paint it for me then, Jessica, because I was just thinking about, where I live. If I venture outside, the likelihood of me being shot at with rubber bullets without being asked any question is actually, frankly, zero at the moment. But if I lived in Diepsloot, and all I wanted to do was to go buy bread. I mean, our colleague Michael Appel encountered a man who was on his way to the bank to pay his rent for the month.
Right.
He was even more compliant than you and I usually are, because he was even carrying that other form that not many people printed. says the police didn't ask. They just fired rubber bullets. So it says to me that the experience is different depending on where you are in terms of class and demographic in this country. What's your take on that?
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I think that there's a common misconception when it comes to especially township and marginalized communities that there is a resistance to order in some way, which is completely false. A lot of the time we will go, especially into townships, and I think because of such the alarming number of people that are in such a small space, we tend to think immediately there is possibility of violence, and especially on behalf of the police officer, whoever is in charge, tends to think a lot of people, this means that I'm in trouble. But at the end of the day, we need to recognize that no matter what class or no matter what community you belong to, you still have human rights and you still have the right to go outside. So going up to someone, for example, that you mentioned, that man who went to the ATM or the bank, going up and asking someone a question, that should be the way that we're doing it. We shouldn't just immediately assume that because someone is from a township and assume that because some people aren't necessarily respecting lockdown at this moment, that doesn't mean that people are violent. It doesn't mean they're standing up against the state. It doesn't mean anything like that, which I think a lot of the time is our assumption, is that if someone isn't respecting lockdown, they're obviously making a point of some kind.
Yeah.
When at the end of the day, people are literally just trying to feed their families. I mean, we're having situations being reported to us of people who earn weekly wages and their employees are still forcing them to come to work. So at the end of the day, we shouldn't be shooting rubber bullets at people who are trying to feed their families or are being threatened by their employees to say, if you don't come to work, we'll fire you. We should actually be looking into, for example, the fact that we still have people in townships who do not have access to running water, to toilets. I mean, you're asking people to stay at home in lockdown and stay sanitized. How are people supposed to do that without access to basic fundamental human rights? So we need to be more understanding, especially when it comes to people in vulnerable communities and townships, because they are experiencing COVID completely differently to the rest of South Africa, and we need to be understanding and respectful of that.
Jessica, I mean, I'm sure we'd also, both agree that with every human right, comes responsibility. And just from the perspective of just citizens here, what also responsibility do you think they too need to uphold, especially when encountering members of the SANDF as well as members of the SAPS? Because I believe that at the same time, there's a sense of responsibility that comes with respecting that badge of honor and, that sense of authority that they also contribute to society. So when tables are turned, what is that responsibility?
Hugely so. With rights comes responsibilities. You cannot separate them. And I think for every South African, it's important now more than ever to try and listen to law enforcement as much as possible. If there is something that you feel you need to communicate, we need to try and communicate using words, not violence either. I think that's hugely important. But I do find, and a lot of information that we're receiving as an organization, is that people have, all of a sudden they're seeing the army in their community telling them to stay indoors. But a lot of people still do not know why. A lot of people have not properly been educated as to what COVID is and what it can potentially do to our entire country, never mind your individual community. So a lot of the time I would say to everyday South Africans is try to educate each other, get the message out there as soon as possible, and frequent updates on information, because the more information we have, the more equipped we will be to understand our responsibility, and we'll be much more likely then to listen to a police officer who says you need to get indoors. So I think a huge thing for us still in this country, yes, lockdown is incredibly important, but unless the people of South Africa understand why the lockdown is happening and has access to really good quality information, I don't see why people would understand the importance of it, and therefore when it comes between going to draw out money at the bank or pay my rent or go get food or medication, I understand completely why people would make that choice.
All right, Jessica Dewhurst, thank you so much for joining us. Your Skype line is crystal clear. I would ask you who your service provider is, but then I'd risk giving them free advertising.